Most people think discipline breaks down because they are weak. That is almost never the real reason. What usually happens is quieter than that, more psychological, more frustrating. A person wakes up wanting to do better, eat better, move more, waste less time. Keep one small promise to themselves. They are not confused about what would improve their life. They know. The problem is that somewhere between intention and action, the brain starts whispering like a defense attorney. You're tired. Start tomorrow. You've had a hard week. One exception won't matter. And just like that, another day disappears. If you are over 40, you probably know this feeling in a deeper way. Because by now, this is not just about habits. It is about trust. Trusting yourself to do what you said you would do. Trusting that change is still possible. So this video is not about forcing yourself harder. It is about something much more useful than that. It is about how to make your brain stop seeing discipline as punishment and start seeing it as relief. The first thing most people misunderstand about discipline is this. They treat it like a moral test. They think discipline is the daily proof that they are serious, mature, strong, committed. And because they see it that way, every failure feels personal. If they skip the workout, waste the evening, eat what they promised not to eat, spend what they said they would save, it does not feel like a small behavioral slip. It feels like a verdict. That is where the real damage begins. Because once the brain links discipline with judgment, it stops seeing discipline as support. It starts seeing it as exposure. Not a structure that helps you, a spotlight that reveals you, and the nervous system does not relax under that kind of relationship. It resists. This is why so many people can be deeply responsible in other parts of life and still feel strangely weak in private habits. They can show up for work, show up for family, handle deadlines, carry weight, keep promises to everyone else. But when it comes to the quiet promises they make to themselves, something slips, not because they do not care, because self-command feels different when no one is watching. And if you are over 40, there is usually more sitting behind that than people realize. At this point in life, discipline is rarely just about the task itself. It starts touching older stories. How many times you tried before, how many things you postponed, how many seasons drifted by while you kept saying, "I know what I need to do." That sentence becomes heavy after enough years. You stop hearing discipline as a path. You start hearing it as accusation. That is why forcing yourself harder often stops working. Force may produce motion for a day or two, a week sometimes. But the brain learns from emotional association, not from your speeches. If every disciplined act feels like deprivation, inner scolding, and pressure, the brain quietly files it away under one category: threat. And once something is categorized as threat, your system starts looking for escape routes. That escape can look respectable. You call it rest when it is avoidance. You call it balance when it is drift. You call it being kind to yourself when really you are trying to get away from the internal pressure discipline now represents. This is why two people can follow the exact same habit and experience it completely differently. One person wakes up, goes for a walk, comes home steadier, cleaner in the head, more like themselves. Another person wakes up, drags themselves through the same walk, resents every minute of it, and comes back feeling managed, constrained, almost punished. Same habit, different relationship, and relationship is everything. That is the part people skip. They think the goal is to become the kind of person who can overpower themselves. But long-term discipline rarely grows from inner warfare. It grows from inner alignment. From teaching the brain slowly and repeatedly that disciplined action is not where freedom ends. It is where friction ends. Think about the strange way people talk to themselves around discipline. They say things like, "I have to make myself do it." That sentence sounds small, but it reveals the whole problem. One part of them is the guard. The other part is the prisoner. One part commands, the other resists. And then they wonder why they feel exhausted before they even begin. No one lives well for long in that split. Eventually, either the guard becomes cruel or the prisoner escapes. So before we talk about how to make the brain like discipline, we need to say something more honest first. Your brain is not always rejecting discipline itself. Sometimes it is rejecting the emotional atmosphere you built around it. The pressure, the shame, the all or nothing thinking, the old disappointment, the feeling that every new attempt must somehow redeem every old failure. That is too much weight to attach to one habit, too much meaning to attach to one morning, too much history to attach to one decision. And this is where the shift begins, not by asking, how do I become harder on myself? But by asking, why does my brain experience discipline as loss in the first place? Because once you answer that, you stop trying to win with force alone. And for the first time, you can begin teaching your mind that discipline is not a cage. It is a way back to yourself. Here is where discipline becomes personal. Not because the habit itself is so difficult, but because the brain is always asking one quiet question beneath the surface. What do I get from this right now? That question is doing more work in your life than most people realize. Your brain is not built to admire discipline in the abstract. It is built to detect reward, relief, safety, and energy conservation. So when a disciplined action feels like effort now and payoff later, the brain does what it has always done. It discounts the future and protects the present. That is not weakness. That is wiring. And once you understand that, a lot of your old frustration starts making more sense. Take something simple. You tell yourself you're going to go to bed earlier. Sensible decision, mature decision. You already know tomorrow will feel better if you do it. But then late evening comes, the house gets quiet, the day finally stops demanding things from you. And suddenly that extra hour of scrolling or snacking or watching something mindless does not feel like laziness. It feels like compensation. That is why discipline is so often harder at night, after stress, after disappointment, after emotionally draining days. In those moments, the brain is not choosing between good and bad. It is choosing between immediate relief and delayed benefit. And immediate relief almost always has the louder voice, especially after 40, because by then, people are tired in layered ways. Decision fatigue, emotional residue, responsibilities that never fully switch off, quiet griefs, financial pressure, bodily changes, the accumulated weight of years spent carrying things well. Under that kind of load, discipline can start to feel less like self-respect and like one more demand in a life already full of demands. That is why your brain does not always resist the habit. Sometimes it resists the feeling of being cornered. This is where many people get it wrong. They try to make discipline stronger without making it safer. They raise the pressure, they tighten the rules, they lecture themselves harder. But the brain does not become loyal through pressure alone. It becomes loyal through pattern. If a behavior repeatedly leads to a felt improvement, cleaner mind, calmer body, less regret, more steadiness, the brain slowly starts trusting it. Not instantly, not dramatically, but gradually. That means discipline becomes easier when the reward stops being theoretical, not, this will help me one day, not, this is what successful people do, not, this is the kind of person I should be. No. The brain learns faster from, I feel better when I do this. I like who I am after this. This reduces friction in my life. This gives me relief I do not have to regret later. That is the beginning of the trick. Not tricking the brain with deception, tricking it by finally speaking its language. Because the brain will always choose what feels rewarding in the moment unless you retrain it. And disciplined people are not different because they have more willpower. They have simply lived long enough to connect certain hard things with a better emotional outcome. They know the walk is not just a walk, it is a better evening. That the early bedtime is not just restraint, it is a less fragile tomorrow. That the saved money is not just deprivation, it is a quieter nervous system. That the workout is not just effort, it is self-trust restored in the body. And once those links become real, discipline stops feeling like a stranger. It starts feeling familiar. People think the goal is to become the kind of person who can overpower themselves. But long-term discipline rarely grows from inner warfare. It grows from inner alignment, from teaching the brain slowly and repeatedly that disciplined action is not where freedom ends. It is where friction ends. So before we talk about how to make your brain like discipline, we need to say something more honest first. Your brain is not always rejecting discipline itself. Sometimes it is rejecting the emotional atmosphere you built around it. The pressure, the shame, the all-or-nothing thinking, the old disappointment. That is too much weight to attach to one habit, too much history to attach to one decision. And this is where the shift begins. Not by asking, how do I become harder on myself? But by asking, why does my brain experience discipline as loss in the first place? Because once you answer that, you stop trying to win with force alone. And for the first time, you can begin teaching your mind that discipline is not a cage. It is a way back to yourself. There is another thing the brain loves more than discipline: predictability. That matters because most people imagine discipline as intensity, a burst of effort, a serious decision, a hard reset. They think the brain is persuaded by force, but the brain is not impressed by intensity for very long. It is calmed by familiarity. That is why you can do something difficult for 3 days and still not trust yourself on the 4th. The action happened, but it did not become familiar. And what is unfamiliar always costs more. This is where many habit attempts quietly fail, not because the goal was wrong, not because the person did not care, but because they kept asking the brain to treat a foreign pattern like home. Wake up earlier, eat differently, move more, spend less, focus longer, stop reaching for easy comfort. The mind hears all of that and thinks, you want me to live somewhere I do not recognize yet. And the nervous system hesitates, especially after 40. Because by this point, routines are not just routines. They are how you cope, how you rest, how you reward yourself, how you recover from disappointment, how you soften loneliness, how you get through dull evenings and heavy mornings. Habits at this age are tied to memory, identity, and emotional survival. That is why changing a habit often feels stranger than people expect. You are not only changing behavior, you are changing the road your brain has used for years to return to itself. Think about someone trying to become more disciplined around food. They do fine all day. Then evening comes. They open the pantry almost without thinking. The snack is not just food. It is ritual. It is familiarity. It is the body saying, we know this road. We have taken it many times. It may not help for long, but at least it is known. That is powerful. The brain often prefers a familiar disappointment over an unfamiliar peace, because unfamiliar peace feels strange at first, empty even. A person cuts back on chaos and suddenly says, I don't even know what to do with myself. Of course not. The noise is gone. The old stimulation is gone. The familiar loop is gone. And without realizing it, they begin craving the very friction they said they wanted to escape. Not because they are irrational, because the brain trusts what repeats. That is why discipline begins to feel easier when you stop presenting it as a dramatic reform and start presenting it as a familiar return. Small matters more than people think. A 10-minute walk done often teaches the brain more than one heroic workout, followed by 5 days of resistance. Putting the phone down 15 minutes earlier teaches the brain more than one perfect night routine, followed by collapse. Saving a small amount consistently teaches the brain more than one big declaration about turning everything around. Why? Because repetition lowers threat. And once threat lowers, resistance lowers with it. This is the part people miss when they rely on motivation. Motivation can introduce a habit, but only repetition makes the habit feel safe enough for the brain to stop arguing with it. That is why the first goal is not mastery. It is familiarity. You are trying to make the disciplined version of life feel less foreign, less like punishment, less like a temporary personality you wear when you are disappointed in yourself, and more like something your system recognizes. This is also where people sabotage themselves. They create rules that sound impressive but are too rigid to live inside. Then, the brain experiences discipline as an environment where one mistake means failure. And once that happens, it never fully relaxes. But the mind learns better inside mercy than inside threat, not laziness, mercy. The kind that says, we are teaching something new here. We are not staging a trial. That changes everything. Because once the brain realizes that discipline does not disappear the moment you stumble, it stops associating discipline with panic. It begins to trust that this new pattern is survivable, repeatable, real. People often assume disciplined people are the ones who never break rhythm. Not true. Very often, they are the people who know how to return without turning one imperfect day into collapse. That is how familiarity grows, not through perfection, through return. Return after the missed workout, return after the wasted evening, return after the overspending, return after the old coping pattern shows up again. Every calm return teaches the brain something force never could. This path is still here. You are still safe on it. You do not need drama to begin again. Then something subtle begins to change. The habit no longer feels like an interruption. It starts feeling like rhythm. You stop asking, how do I become more intense? And you begin asking a better question. How do I make the right thing feel more normal? That is where discipline starts to stop feeling forced. There's one more reason discipline feels hard. The brain hates uncertainty, but it also hates loss. And discipline, at first, often feels like loss. Loss of comfort, loss of ease, loss of spontaneity, loss of the little rewards that helped you get through the day. That is why people often fail, not when discipline is impossible, but when it starts to feel too expensive emotionally. A person decides to save money. Good decision, sensible decision. But the brain does not experience it as future stability. It experiences it as not buying the thing. A person decides to eat better. The brain does not first register better health. It registers not having the comfort food. A person decides to be more consistent. The brain does not first feel self-respect. It feels more structure, less escape. And if you do not understand that, you will keep thinking your problem is laziness. It is not always laziness. Sometimes it is grief. Small grief maybe. Quiet grief. But grief all the same, because every disciplined life requires giving something up. Not always something good, but something familiar. And familiarity has emotional weight. This is especially true after 40, because by then, people are not just managing habits. They are managing attachment. Attachment to routines, to comforts, to ways of coping, to private rituals that help them survive seasons nobody else fully saw. That late-night snack may not just be a snack. It may be the reward at the end of years of strain. That overspending may not just be impulsiveness. It may be a quick, borrowed feeling of relief. That procrastination may not just be avoidance. It may be the only softness a person knows how to give themselves. So when discipline enters the room, the brain does not always say, "This is good for me." Sometimes it says, "What are you taking from me now?" That question matters. Because if discipline keeps arriving like a thief, the mind will defend itself. It will bargain, delay, rationalize, rebel. Not because you are weak, because your system thinks it is being deprived. This is where many people make the next mistake. They try to answer loss with even more harshness. They say, "Stop being dramatic, just do it, grow up." But that only deepens the conflict, because the part of you resisting is not always childish. Sometimes it is simply afraid of having even less comfort than it already has. That part needs leadership, yes. But it also needs translation. It needs to learn that discipline is not only subtraction, it is exchange. You are not just giving something up. You are getting something back. You give up the extra spending. You get back a quieter mind. You give up the endless scrolling. You get back attention. You give up the chaotic sleep. You get back a steadier morning. You give up the false comfort. You get back self-trust. That is the language your brain must begin to hear. Not, "Look what I can't have," but, "Look what returns to me when I stop leaking energy." This is why discipline becomes more attractive when you name the gain immediately and clearly. not in vague future terms, in present emotional terms. I feel cleaner after this. I feel less heavy when I do this. This makes tomorrow easier. This reduces regret. This protects my peace. Those are not slogans. They are signals. And the brain listens to signals more than speeches. It also helps to stop treating every act of discipline like a grand identity test. Sometimes people make one choice carry too much meaning. If they fail, they feel ashamed. If they succeed, they feel strained. Either way, the act becomes emotionally loaded. But discipline works better when it is lighter. Less theater, more rhythm, less self-judgment, more honest exchange. You are not trying to become a machine. You are trying to become a person whose actions stop draining their own life. That is different. And once your brain begins to see disciplined action as a trade that leaves you better off, something changes. The craving does not disappear overnight. The resistance does not vanish in 1 week. But the meaning changes. The choice no longer feels like pure loss. It starts to feel like protection. And that is when discipline stops sounding like punishment. It starts sounding like care. There is another shift that changes discipline completely. It is the shift from force to identity. At first, most people try to become disciplined by managing behavior from the outside. They make rules, set alarms, build systems, remove temptations. All of that can help. But it never goes deep enough if discipline still feels unnatural to who they believe they are. Because the brain pays very close attention to identity. If a habit feels like something a different kind of person would do, it always costs more. I'm trying to be more disciplined, but underneath that sentence is another one. This is not really me yet. And the brain feels that gap, especially after 40, because by that age, identity has weight. People are not just carrying preferences, they're carrying decades of self-story. I've always been this way. I'm not naturally consistent. I start strong, then I fall off. I've never been the disciplined type. Those sentences sound small, but the brain listens to repetition. And once a story repeats enough, it stops sounding like a thought. It starts sounding like truth. That is why discipline becomes easier the moment it stops being treated like costume and starts being treated like character. Not performance, not branding, not a temporary version of yourself. Character in the quiet sense. The kind built through repeated evidence. This matters because the brain does not fully trust declarations. It trusts small proof, repeated. A person says, I want to be more disciplined. Fine. But if they keep breaking every promise to themselves, the deeper identity stays the same. Their nervous system keeps saying, we are not someone who follows through. That is painful because self-trust is not lost only in dramatic moments. It is lost in tiny betrayals no one else sees. The walk you said you would take, the bedtime you said you would protect, the money you said you would stop wasting, the hour you said you would use well. When those things keep collapsing, the damage is not only practical, it becomes personal. You start doubting your own word. And once that doubt settles in, discipline no longer feels like structure. It feels like humiliation, another chance to prove that you cannot trust yourself. This is why the solution is not bigger promises. It is smaller evidence. You do not rebuild identity by making dramatic vows. You rebuild it by giving the brain enough quiet proof that a different self is beginning to exist. One completed walk. One cleaner morning. One night you stopped when you said you would stop. One purchase you did not make. One hard thing you did without turning it into a speech. That kind of evidence matters because every time you act in alignment, even briefly, the brain updates the file. Maybe this is us now. Maybe we are changing. Maybe this is becoming true. And that is how discipline starts becoming less exhausting. Not because the action becomes effortless, but because the inner argument gets smaller. You stop negotiating from scratch every day. That is what many people miss. They think discipline is mostly about effort, but effort is highest when identity is unclear. Once the self-story begins to stabilize, behavior costs less. Not nothing, less. A person who truly sees themselves as someone who protects their mornings does not have to reinvent that choice every night. A person who truly sees themselves as someone who keeps small promises does not need endless motivation to keep one. This does not happen in 1 week. And it does not happen through self-hypnosis. It happens through lived evidence. That is why discipline grows better through modest consistency than through dramatic reinvention. Reinvention is exciting, but the brain often treats it like theater. Consistency is quieter, but the brain takes it seriously. Think about how trust works in any lasting relationship, not through one emotional speech, not through one big sacrifice, through repetition, through reliability, through the ordinary experience of someone doing what they said they would do. Your relationship with yourself is no different. If you want a more disciplined life, you need more than better plans. You need more evidence that you are becoming a person you can believe. That is the deeper work. Not forcing, not performing, not proving yourself in public, becoming believable in private. And once the brain begins to believe you, something subtle changes. Discipline stops feeling like a fight against your nature and starts feeling like an expression of it. You stop dragging yourself toward the right action. The action begins to fit. It belongs. So instead of asking, how do I force myself to become disciplined? Ask something deeper. What kind of person am I proving myself to be, one action at a time? Because once the brain starts believing you, discipline stops feeling borrowed. It starts feeling like something that is quietly becoming your own. There is another reason people struggle with discipline, and it hides in plain sight. They keep making it too big. The brain does not only resist difficulty, it resists scale. The moment a person says, I need to change my whole life, the nervous system feels the weight of that sentence before a single action happens. It hears pressure. It hears permanence. It hears the threat of disappointment waiting in advance. That is why so many attempts begin with energy and end with avoidance. The goal was too large to feel safe, especially after 40, because by then, people are not making habits in a vacuum. They are making them inside real lives, jobs, families, fatigue, obligations, money concerns, bodies that recover differently. Even when the desire is sincere, the system quietly asks, where exactly is all this effort supposed to fit? And if the answer feels vague, the brain pulls back. This is why discipline becomes more possible when it gets smaller, not bigger. Smaller does not mean weaker. It means more believable. A person says, I'm going to work out every day for an hour. Maybe. But the brain has heard dramatic declarations before. It does not trust intensity. It trusts repetition. Now compare that with, I'm going to put my shoes on and walk for 10 minutes. That sounds almost unimpressive, which is exactly why it works better. The first goal threatens the whole system. The second slips past resistance. This is one of the hidden truths of discipline. The brain often accepts what the ego finds boring, and that is hard for people who want a turning point, a dramatic shift, a clean, powerful beginning that proves they are serious this time. But the life that changes you is usually built in movements too small to impress anyone. A glass of water before coffee, 5 minutes of stretching, one expense you do not make, 10 minutes of reading, going to bed when you said you would, once, then again. Tiny actions look weak from the outside, but psychologically, they do something enormous. They lower friction, and lower friction matters more than high emotion, because every time the action is small enough to complete, the brain gets a new message. This is doable. This is not a threat. This may actually belong in my life. That is how momentum starts, not through intensity, through completion. People talk about discipline as if the hardest part is effort. Often it is not. Often it is emotional entry. Starting, crossing the line between intention and movement. Small actions help because they reduce the emotional cost of entry. And once you start, something shifts. The walk may become longer. The reading may continue. The kitchen may get cleaned. The phone may stay down longer than planned. But that is not the point. The point is that the brain did not have to fight a giant war just to begin. This is where many people sabotage themselves. They refuse to respect small wins because small wins do not satisfy the fantasy. They still want the perfect week, the big comeback, the version of themselves that changes overnight and never slips again. But fantasy is expensive, and discipline grows best in what is sustainable, not dramatic. Think about how trust works in relationships. It is rarely built by one grand gesture. It is built by repeated reliability. Someone says they will show up, and they do. Again and again. That is what makes them trustworthy. Your brain works the same way. It starts trusting you when you stop making huge emotional speeches and start becoming quietly reliable. That is why small discipline is not childish. It is strategic. It respects how the mind actually changes. A person who keeps one small promise a day is often moving toward real stability faster than the person who keeps announcing a total reset and collapsing by Thursday. Because the brain is watching for proof, not passion. And proof accumulates. This is also why consistency feels so powerful once it begins. Not because each act is impressive, but because each act reduces inner argument. The more often you do the small right thing, the less your mind has to debate whether it is possible. It starts becoming normal. And normal is where discipline gets strong. Not when it feels heroic, when it feels ordinary. That may sound less exciting than most people want. But ordinary is what survives. So if discipline keeps slipping through your hands, the question may not be, how do I become more motivated? It may be, what is small enough for my brain to trust today? That is a better question. Kinder, smarter, and much more effective. Because once the brain trusts the step, it will stop fighting the path quite so hard. There is one more thing that makes discipline easier. The brain needs to feel progress, not imagined progress, not future progress, felt progress. That matters because the mind can endure effort longer than people think, but it struggles to endure effort that feels invisible. If a person keeps doing the right thing and feels no immediate shift, the brain starts questioning the value of the whole process. Is this even working? Why does this still feel hard? How long do I have to keep doing this before it feels natural? Those questions wear people down, especially after 40, because by then, many people are already carrying quiet disappointment from earlier attempts. They have tried plans before, started routines before, promised themselves change before. So when results are slow, it does not just feel frustrating, it feels familiar. And familiar frustration can be dangerous. It can wake up the old story. Here we go again, another phase, another promise that fades. This is why discipline becomes more sustainable when you stop waiting for dramatic outcomes and start learning how to notice smaller evidence. Better sleep is evidence. Less regret is evidence. A calmer morning is evidence. A cleaner kitchen is evidence. A lighter mind is evidence. Keeping one promise is evidence. The problem is that many people only count visible transformation, weight lost, money saved, major milestones, big before and after moments. But the brain often needs smaller proof first. It needs to feel that something is already changing, even if the outer results are still modest. That is how motivation survives long enough to become trust. A person takes a walk for a week and says, nothing has really changed. Not true. Maybe their body is still the same. Maybe the mirror says nothing new. But maybe they are less foggy at 3 p.m. Maybe they are slightly less restless at night. Maybe they are proving they can return. That counts. In fact, it matters more than people realize, because when you start noticing these quieter forms of progress, the brain stops seeing discipline as pure effort. It begins seeing it as movement. And movement is easier to stay loyal to than sacrifice. This is why tracking can help, but only if it is used wisely. Not as pressure, not as a scoreboard of worth, but as evidence that the pattern is real, evidence that you are not imagining the shift, evidence that repetition is slowly becoming identity. A check mark can matter. A short note can matter. A simple sentence like, "I felt better after that," can matter. Why? Because the brain learns from reinforcement, and reinforcement does not always need to be dramatic. Sometimes it is enough to pause and tell the truth. That helped. That was worth it. I'm glad I did that. This day went better because I followed through. Those moments matter. They teach the brain that discipline is not just about denying comfort. It is about creating a life that feels cleaner to live inside. This also changes your relationship with setbacks. If progress is only measured by perfection, then one difficult day ruins the whole story. But if progress is measured by pattern, one difficult day becomes what it really is. A day, not a prophecy, not a verdict, not proof that you are back where you started. Just a day. That kind of thinking protects momentum. And momentum is precious, because once the brain starts to feel progress, even small progress, discipline stops feeling like a tax. It starts feeling like investment, not in some distant fantasy version of you. In the life you are already living, the morning you wake up in, the bills you pay, the body you carry, the mind you have to inhabit every day. That is the real turning point. When discipline stops being about becoming impressive and starts being about becoming easier to live with, that is when the brain begins to soften, because now it sees something it can trust, not pressure, not punishment, not endless waiting. And movement, if you keep honoring it, becomes belief. That is how discipline stops feeling like something you are trying to manufacture and starts feeling like something you are slowly proving. Not through drama, not through intensity, not through one perfect week, through evidence, through the quiet accumulation of days that went a little better because you stayed with the right thing. And once the brain begins to believe that better is actually happening, even in small ways, it stops resisting quite so hard. It begins to come with you. If you are still here with me this far into the video, let me say something simple. Subscribe to the channel and stay close. We are here every day for conversations like this. Calm ones, honest ones. The kind that do not try to impress you for a few seconds and disappear. The kind that stay with you a little longer. And if this subject has been sitting somewhere deep in you, that makes sense. Because most people are not failing at discipline because they are incapable. They are failing because they keep approaching it through the wrong relationship. They keep trying to dominate themselves, correct themselves, scare themselves into consistency, shame themselves into structure, and for a while, that can create movement. But it does not create peace. And without peace, discipline always starts feeling heavy again. That is the deeper shift here. Discipline becomes more sustainable the moment you stop treating it like a punishment for who you have been and start treating it like protection for who you are becoming. That changes the emotional tone completely. You are no longer waking up and asking, "How do I force myself today?" You start asking, "What helps me live cleaner today? What reduces friction? What protects tomorrow? What keeps me from abandoning myself again in small, invisible ways?" That is a different kind of discipline. Quieter, less theatrical, less built on intensity, much more built on respect. And that matters, especially in midlife. Because by now you already know what chaos costs. You know what it costs to keep living at the mercy of moods. You know what it costs to keep making promises and then watching them dissolve. You know what it costs to keep reaching for comfort that feels good for 10 minutes and leaves a stain on the rest of the day. At some point, the brain begins to see the pattern, not perfectly, not all at once, but enough to notice the trade. The late-night scrolling steals the morning. The avoidance steals momentum. The impulsive spending steals calm. The inconsistency steals trust. And once you see that clearly, discipline stops looking like restriction. It starts looking like recovery. That is when it begins to soften, because now the disciplined choice is no longer just the harder choice. It becomes the kinder choice. Kinder to your body, kinder to your future, kinder to your mind when it is tired, kinder to the part of you that is exhausted from living in internal contradiction. This is why the real work is not becoming a stricter person. It is becoming a more honest one. Honest enough to admit what your habits are costing. Honest enough to stop romanticizing chaos. Honest enough to see that some of the things you call freedom are really just expensive forms of drift. And honest enough to let small, steady discipline become more attractive than dramatic self-reinvention. Because that is where real change usually lives, not in the perfect Monday, not in the big declaration, not in the mood that makes you feel unstoppable for 48 hours. In the ordinary return, the repeated choice, the less exciting decision, the thing you do even when nobody sees it, the thing you do because it keeps your life from leaking. That kind of discipline may not look glamorous, but it has a kind of beauty to it, a grown beauty, a clean beauty, a beauty built from fewer regrets. And once your brain begins to understand that discipline is not taking your life away, but giving parts of it back, you stop needing to drag yourself quite so violently. The resistance gets quieter, the pattern gets more familiar, the identity gets more believable. And then slowly, discipline begins to feel less like something you keep trying to start, and more like something you are finally learning how to live inside. Maybe this is the right place to end. Not with the promise that you will now become perfectly disciplined. Not with the fantasy that from this point on every morning will be clean, every choice sharp, every habit effortless. Life is not that obedient. And if you are old enough, you already know that. There are weeks when energy disappears for reasons you cannot fully explain. Seasons when the body feels slower. Days when the mind feels crowded. Times when grief, stress, loneliness, boredom, or simple exhaustion make even small things feel heavier than they should. So this was never really about becoming flawless. It was about becoming less divided, because that is what undisciplined living often feels like in the end. Division. One part of you wants peace. Another part keeps choosing what steals it. One part wants stability. Another part keeps reaching for what feels good for 10 minutes and costs you for 10 hours. One part wants to trust yourself. Another part keeps breaking the quiet agreements no one else even knows you made. That split is more tiring than the walk, more tiring than the bedtime, more tiring than the money you chose not to waste, more tiring than the small, boring act you keep postponing. And maybe that is the strange truth underneath all of this. Discipline is not exhausting in the deepest way. Contradiction is. Living against yourself is exhausting. Needing to renegotiate your own values every day is exhausting. Wanting a better life while feeding the habits that weaken it is exhausting. That is what wears people down. So when discipline starts becoming lighter, it is not because life suddenly got easier. It is because the inner war got quieter. The brain stopped seeing every good choice as punishment. The body stopped treating structure like threat. The self stopped turning every imperfect day into a courtroom. And in that quieter place, something important returns. Dignity, not pride, not performance. Dignity. The quiet dignity of being able to rely on yourself a little more. The quiet dignity of keeping one promise, of following one clean path, of ending the day with less leakage, less regret, less noise. That may not look dramatic from the outside, but inside a life, it changes everything. Because self-trust is built in small, private moments. In the moment you stop when you said you would stop. In the moment you begin when you said you would begin. In the moment you return instead of collapsing into the old story. In the moment you choose what protects your life instead of what briefly distracts you from it. That is where your brain begins to change, not in speeches, not in grand reinventions, in repeated evidence. And maybe that is the real trick. You do not force your brain into liking discipline by becoming harsher. You teach it by showing over and over that discipline leads somewhere kinder than chaos does. A calmer morning, a steadier body, a quieter mind, a little more money left, a little less shame, a little more respect when you look at your own life. That is not small. That is the beginning of freedom in adult form. Not the freedom of doing whatever you feel in the moment. The freedom of not being ruled by every feeling that passes through. And that kind of freedom is not loud. It does not announce itself. It does not always look exciting. Sometimes it looks like going to bed on time, like saying no quietly, like taking the walk, like closing the tab, like leaving the card in your wallet, like doing the ordinary thing again. But ordinary things, repeated, shape entire lives. So the next time you feel that old resistance, the next time discipline sounds heavy, the next time your brain starts whispering that this is too much, too strict, too joyless, pause for a second and ask a different question. Not, what am I losing? But what returns to me if I stay with this? Peace may return. Clarity may return. Self-respect may return. Trust may return. And maybe that is enough to begin again. If this video stayed with you, subscribe to the channel and share it with 5 people who might need it too. And if you want, leave a sincere comment below. Tell me what part of this touched something in you, or tell me what subject you want us to talk about in the next video.